Hello and welcome back to the libertarianism.uk podcast with me, your host, Andy Duncan. Today we're speaking to what I'm going to call one of my favourite new Austrians, and that's the splendid, the amazing, the fantastic Per Bylund from Sweden, who's currently living in Oklahoma. Now, he's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He's also professor of entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. Now, there he is, and what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about his book, his new book, recent book, How to Think About the Economy. Now, before we get into that, I'd like to learn a little bit more about Per. So we're going to do the man behind the book. Then we'll talk about the book, and then we'll just finish off with a brief discussion about the current state of the current world economy. And then we'll mention places where you can get his book, where you can get other books he's written, and a few other contact details. So that's the shape of the show. So you be ready for this, Per. You ready? Be excited. Welcome till programmet. Do you like that?
Wow. Yeah, I do.
Fantastic.
Oh,
it's just natural. I just woke up being able to speak this fantastic Norse language. So hello and welcome to the program today. Now, you are not 24 hours from Tulsa, but you're in near Tulsa, and I'm 7 hours ahead of Tulsa. So I was just wondering, being in Oklahoma, do you miss Sweden at the moment?
I miss parts of it. I miss, obviously the friends and family, some of the cooking, Swedish candy for sure, some of the traditions. I mean, those sort of things that I grew up with, and that are sort of part of what it means to be alive, or I guess other things I do not miss. So I don't necessarily miss, certain parts of the culture, the sort of envy that is part of it. That's something I don't really like. The politics, I don't like. The welfare state, I don't like. The taxes, I don't like. But it turns out that the United States, taxes are not really that low. I was thinking that they were a whole lot lower, but compared to Sweden, they are lower, but they're nowhere near a reasonable level. They're so much higher than that.
Is Oklahoma one of those tax-free states like Florida, or do you have to pay state tax as well as federal?
No, Oklahoma is this weird place where the state is really, really conservative. It's even more conservative than Texas is. But for some reason, we have a state income tax, we have property tax, we have state sales tax, we have a bloated government that is... Even in studies of how free are the 50 states, that sort of thing, Oklahoma comes across as like having a very big and costly state. And of course, the teachers union is really powerful and all this stuff. So it's a really strange place to be, because the culture is really conservative, yet the policies are not, unless we're talking about things like abortion and guns.
Yeah, sounds like the politics there. They sounds like New Jersey. It's kind of sounds like that kind of a thing going on.
Yeah, it's definitely anti-woke in that sense. So I think I'm not sure if it passed already or if it's going through the houses, but there's an attempt to at least try to prohibit. What do they call it? The new race theory thing, right? So they're trying to prohibit that from being taught in schools. So that you wouldn't see, of course, in a progressive state like New Jersey. And here it's sort of it's obvious that would happen. On the other hand, we have medical marijuana. So there was no real resistance to that, and they even wrote those rules. So permitting, if you will, that anyone can really get a permit to get medical marijuana. All it takes is a card, and there are even doctors who have simply opened like an online office, more or less, and hand out cards. So it's in practice, it's almost legalized, which is also surprising. So it's a strange place to be, in a sense. It's not really what you would expect.
Strange melange. Anyway, I just wanted to get in, before we talk about your book, How to Think About the Economy, I just wanted to know a little bit more about you. So I think you come from the islands, which are in an archipelago off Stockholm. Now, I ask you two questions together. How did you get from there to being a professor of entrepreneurship in the United States. And I'd like to just mix into that. Along that way, how and when did you become an Austrian?
Wow. Okay. So that's a big question. So you're right. I grew up just outside of Stockholm, very close to the Baltic Sea. So I've been sailing my whole life. The family spent basically the whole summers on sailboats, just hopping island to island. So that's one of the parts that I definitely miss of Swedish summers, I should say, not in the winter, of course. So from there, I mean, I got into college, studied business, and happened to end up in a business and computers kind of program. So I ended up getting a degree in 98. And so I was studying both computers and business at the same time. They more or less offered me to get a master's in informatics. So I figured, why not? And I mean, this was late 90s. So computers were hot. Even the internet was the big thing, right? Every business needed to have their products showcased on the static websites, right? So in 99, I graduated with a master's in informatics, which is basically systems development for business. And then I started a career in that. At the same time, I was active in politics and interested in political reasoning and discussions on political ideas. So I on the side of my job, I got a master's in political science, political theory. And I realized, after my wife told me so, but then I realized that this job was not really for me. It was interesting, but it was not all that exciting after a while, and it sort of made me miserable. And I was spending most of my time arguing and reasoning and in a sense, theorizing anyway.
Yep.
So I tried to shift into academia instead, where I could actually do that for a living. And in Sweden, that turned out to be pretty much impossible, because there are plenty of restrictions on who gets into the PhD programs and everything. I mean, I think that I applied for several years, but the best year, there were like 4 PhD students in political science admitted in the country.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah, and you can only apply for a PhD program where you already have a master's degree, so that limits what you can apply for. Not in like in the US, when if you have a college degree, you can go to grad school no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And of course, as being a white guy interested in libertarian political philosophy, let's just say that the interest in having me as a PhD student was very limited.
Yeah.
So what I did was send my CV to Jeff Tucker, who was then the vice president of the Mises Institute, where I'd already been publishing a few essays. So I sent my resume to him, and I said, you know, a lot of professors who are affiliated with the Institute, maybe you know someone who could take me on as a student. And I think the very next day I had an email from Peter Klein, who was then at Missouri, saying, how about coming to Missouri?
Wow, great.
And he was then in the Department of Agricultural Economics after he had been at Georgia before. And I mean, I applied and then I packed my bags, and of course I stopped to look at a map and see where the heck is Missouri. But after that, I packed my bags and I left for Missouri, and I did 5 years there, I think, to get the PhD, and the PhD in applied economics, focusing on the firm more than anything else. So my grad school buddies were interested in such things as corn prices and stuff like that, which to me was like not all interesting. But I did organizations and firms and entrepreneurship and things like that. So moving from one discipline to the next in academia is really, really hard, because you're supposed to be sort of brought up within the silo and then stay in the silo.
Yep.
So moving from applied or agricultural economics into entrepreneurship was super hard. But it turns out that I was playing squash with a guy and also with his advisor in the business school. And his advisor it was his turn to be the chair of the management department. And he said, well, aren't you an entrepreneurship guy? And I was like, yeah, sure. And he said, we need someone to teach entrepreneurship. Because there was one of those things that in a management department, typically entrepreneurship is one of those things that no one want to touch because it's not real. So he offered me to teach courses. So right when I graduated, I got to teach full-time as an adjunct. So I didn't actually make any money, but I got to teach in entrepreneurship, which means I was actually in the field suddenly.
Yep.
And during that year, a position at Baylor opened in doing only research on entrepreneurship and policy. So I got that position, and then from there I moved to Oklahoma State. So
brilliant.
That's why I'm an entrepreneurship professor. Yes, it's a straight line, right?
Well, a big thumbs up to Jeff Tucker there. Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff, if you're watching, for giving Per his step up. Now, you mentioned a couple of things I thought were interesting there. The one was that you were involved in Swedish local politics, and then you just put in and something about being a libertarian. So how did you go from someone who's interested in local politics to being a libertarian?
Well, I mean, those happened at the same time. It's really strange, but I recall, because I was elected in the fall of '98. And I remember that election campaign, me and my buddy working our asses off in the election campaign, we were trying to figure out how to get rid of government theoretically, because we were both sort of principled libertarians already, but we couldn't figure out how it could possibly work without a system of courts and law and that sort of thing. So we drafted all these kinds of different systems and different blueprints, if you will, on how it might work. And then I came across David Friedman's The Machinery of Freedom.
Machinery of Freedom, yeah.
And then I realized that, oh man, that was simple. I didn't have to go through all these advanced attempts trying to draft something. I could just let go, because there is no guarantee anyway. So why would I? So I became an anarchist just as I was elected for office. But so
that's such a strange kind of dichotomy, that elected for office, I'm an anarchist.
Yeah, it was really weird. But that's why I remember it so clearly too, that it was this contradiction. And of course, my friend and I, we were both elected at the same time, so we could cause a lot of problems in local parliament, and we made a lot of fuss about everything. But of course, we made no difference whatsoever, right? Even though we were really loud and we tried all this stuff, we put in a lot of hours and made a lot of allies who wanted to make changes and things like that. It was still no. Even my own party fought me tooth and nail just to get rid of me, because we just regained majority and everything. So you should just sit down and shut up, because now we have power finally, right? And to me, I thought, well, if we actually have the power, then we can actually make changes. And that's going way too far, right? So that's not what the system is built for. So I learned very quickly that that's not what you're supposed to do. And I was already a libertarian, so of course I wanted to go far, but I didn't try to cause a libertarian revolution locally or anything like that. I just tried to. I think the very first meeting was deciding on the tax rate, and the local income tax in Sweden back then was about 30% something. So I proposed lowering it just as a sort of symbolic thing, but lowering it by 0.1% or something silly like that, right? Just to show that we want to go in that direction. And it was immediately voted down, and people thought I was a lunatic and everything like that. So that was sort of the beginning of my career as an elected official.
Yeah, wow. I had a similar experience. I won't go into my similar experience many, many years ago, where you just suddenly realize that everything's completely wrong, so you've got to move on. Now, that brings us neatly up, I think, to the book. So let's talk about the book, How to Think About an Economy. You've mentioned the link with the Mises Institute there. So how did you get to be the one who writes that book?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because if there's anything that I'm not good at, it's expressing myself very clearly in short terms. So that's something I've been struggling with for a long time. But my wife likes to tell me that when I really understand something, then I can do it. But before then, no, I suck. So having studied Austrian economics for quite some time, and I mean, I had the chance to go to the Mises Institute a number of times while I was in grad school. So I participated in those events. I studied Austrian economics a lot on the side of getting the PhD and everything like that. I mean, eventually you get how things work. And I'm sure you've had the same experience too, that people ask, oh, well, what is this Austrian economics they're talking about? Where can I read something to learn more? What's a good introduction?
Yeah.
right? And where do you direct people? Well, I mean, the standard would be Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson.
Yeah.
But it's not really an overview of Austrian economics. It's really one lesson. I mean, it's not a lie. It is one lesson. It's just applied over and over and over again. But it doesn't really give you an insight into Austrian business cycle theory or how Austrians regard market prices and why those are different from distorted prices and things like that. So if you want an introduction to Austrian economics, then there's not really very good introduction out there. There are several, but I think they're definitely not perfect. Some of them are really hard to read, even though they are short. And some of them are really expensive because they're published by academic publishers. So they're like $100 or something like that. So I actually brought it up with Jeff Dice, the president of the Mises Institute back then, who, and I told him that we need a really short, really easy to understand sort of introduction that we can just give to people. As soon as they ask, what is this Austrian economics? Then here, read this. It'll take you a few hours. Everybody can get it. It's cheap. And I mean, anyone who is a proponent of Austrian economics can buy a dozen copies and just hand out to friends, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And Jeff thought that was a great idea. And so he said, okay, do it. And then I struggled with putting it together. But I had in mind to write something that even sort of my grandma or that sort of persona could understand. And something, talking to Jeff, something that was half as long as Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And written in the same way. So it's supposed to be to the point, clear, short sentences, no jargon, everything like that, right? Yeah. And that's what I tried to do. It was hard, but
I tend to think of Economics in One Lesson as it's like the Pulp Fiction of primers, because it's a lot of slightly connected stories that all come back to one central theme, but it's not a systematic overview of Austrian economics. Economics for Real People by Gene Callahan, I think it just goes off of too many tangents and it's a bit too thick and a bit too long a read. And then there's the Austrian Economics, a primer by Eamon Butler, which is just a bit too thin and just a bit too small. So when you're writing the book, so you're trying to get this system, so you're trying to get man, economy and state and human action, and you're trying to get them down into this book you can read in 2 hours. What were your greatest challenges distilling man, economy and state and human action down into a 2-hour book?
Well, this kind of sounds strange, but it wasn't really a problem to figure out what was going to be in it.
Yeah.
The problem was to find sort of the right level and tone to begin with. So right in the first chapter, I don't know how many times I wrote the first chapter and it just wasn't right. It was either too much, so it became way too long, or I covered things that weren't necessary, perhaps, or I skipped something that, well, I mean, it just wasn't right. So the biggest problem was just figuring out where exactly to put the reasoning and the discussion. I think I was pretty clear. It was pretty clear to me from the beginning that not having a historical overview of the school and not focusing on the people and the evolution of the school and its theories, because that's something that most of these introductions have, not Hazlitt's, because it's only that one lesson. But if it's about the Austrian theory of economics, then they tend to say, oh, it all begins with Karl Menger. And then you talk about the generations, and then you talk about how von Bauwerk married Wieser's sister or whatever, all of those things, which are fun for someone who is already an Austrian. But if you're not an Austrian, you want to know what are Austrians saying is completely irrelevant. No one cares. And you can look at that somewhere else in a history book or something, right? So I wanted to just cover what the heck is economics first, because people have these strange ideas of what it is. So that's the first part of the book, just discussing, okay, how can we think about the economy? And just saying that, well, the economy is all of us interacting and economizing, and it works somehow. We don't need to create how we interact, but it is something that we can actually figure out how it works. And then a part that is the market. How does the market actually work? Go into more detail about where the prices come from. How does production function? What is production? How can we see that calculation and things like that? And then, of course, at the end, throw in interventions that now that you already know how the market process works, okay, what are the actual effects?
Or should work. How should it work?
But how it works in itself, right? So the market itself, if nothing else is affecting it, how would it work? And of course, the first part is, how can we know this, right? And it's pretty clear, I think, when you read it, that, yeah, we can know this, and it's pretty easy to know this. It's just that a lot of people tend to reject that because, oh, no, it's just theory. And then at the end, then just talking about regulations and different impositions on the market and what the effects are. And I think two chapters, one meddling with money, how that causes the business cycle, and one about regulations, how that causes distortions all over the place.
Now, one thing I liked about the book, actually, it's not completely stripped down like Eamon Butler's book, which is just really a series of bullet points, slightly expanded. You did add a couple of extra things. So if you look at Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, it is going on from Bastiat, the seen and the unseen. But you've added something on top of that, the unrealized, on top of the seen and the unseen, which is your last chapter, and I think the most interesting last part of the last chapter. Can you just, for our listeners today, can you just explain what's different between the unrealized and the unseen?
Yeah. So this is something I developed in my previous book, The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, which really talks about regulation. Because I always had a problem with when you're talking about the seen and the unseen, it's always just the present. And say, oh, you like the Bastiat story, right? With the baker's son crashing a window. And people say, oh, that's good because the glacier is going to get more business. And then they realize, no, wait, this means that the baker can no longer buy whatever it was he was going to buy because he has to buy a window instead. So it's both sides of the story, right? But the problem is also that if you regulate the economy, what that means is really that you're restricting people's choices. There are certain things that they're no longer allowed to do. And entrepreneurs make money by offering goods and services consumers that they like more than any other entrepreneur has offered. So if you're restricting entrepreneurs from going into a certain space, whatever it might be, to produce there, then of course those products that consumers would choose potentially are not going to be there. But these entrepreneurs might do something else. They're going to produce something else that to them is not as valuable as what they were going to produce, which of course distorts the whole economy because it shifts resources from the value that they can no longer produce to something that is of lesser value. Which means, since the economy is also cumulative, right, that entrepreneurs, they react on what is there and they try to improve on it and they try to be even better. What this means after a few generations is that, well, nothing is what it would have been. We're not getting at all those options that should have been available. And in the book, The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, I use the sweatshop as an example, saying that usually the sort of the seen argument is that, well, sweatshop is terrible. Look at all these people. There's no air conditioning and they work too many hours and there's no healthcare insurance and whatever else. Well, okay. But it's also the case that their options are not very good. So the option might be toiling in the fields, or it might be prostitution, or it might just be simply starvation. So they actually choose it. And that's sort of the seen and the unseen of that situation. But the unrealized is that, well, if it is the case that there can be a sweatshop, how come the market doesn't have several sweatshops at the same place? How come there's only one sweatshop and all the other options are terrible? Well, something must have stopped other potential sweatshop entrepreneurs from creating their sweatshops and competing with the one that exists. And those must be regulations, because otherwise you're saying that, well, some entrepreneurs just don't want profit. But that's silly. Yeah. Because obviously there's at least one, right? So something is keeping them out of the market, which leaves these people in poor countries with much fewer and worse options. And that's the unrealized, all those beautiful jobs that they would have had, because we can easily see that had there not been only one sweatshop, but several, the sweatshop jobs would have been better too, because they would have competed for their workers. So they would have offered fewer hours, better working conditions, paid vacation, whatever it might be, right? That people would like. So the jobs in the sweatshops would have been better too, and there would have been more jobs in sweatshops. So the option situation, the situation of choosing a job would be completely different for these people without regulations.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw something similar in England in the Industrial Revolution, because when the Industrial Revolution got going, people were living in grinding poverty on the land, sowing turnips and growing turnips. And then when the first factories came along, they flocked to those factories to get off the land and the horrible life they had in the land. But of course, the people the wealthy people in the city said, oh, look at these terrible factories. They're awful. Let's regulate them. And so then you've stymied the growth of the factories, and so therefore people on the land are stuck on the land, and we get to the situation that you just described. Now you've divided the book into three nice sections: economics, what's the second part, the market, and then you've got the intervention part. Now, one thing I like about all the way through the book, you've lifted up the idea of the entrepreneur and human action, and the entrepreneur taking risks and waiting before they get paid and so on. How does what I'm going to call normal economics just doesn't even have the entrepreneur at all? If you look at something like Keynesian economics, it's just about aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Government creates a fake interest rate, pumps extra money into the economy, and everything's good. How do you think proper economics can survive without us all laughing at it, without an entrepreneur in it at all? How does normal economics survive without the idea of the entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the reason they can survive is that most economists are either hired by the government or they work to supply the government with arguments through like lobbyists, or they do sort of government-like things, that they work in big insurance companies trying to calculate what the premium should be and the risk and so forth. So they're really, in a sense, they're failed statisticians using statistics on economics sounding things, but they're not actually doing economics. I think from this perspective, it doesn't really matter, because then the entrepreneur, well, that's just about how many new small businesses or how many businesses are started one year versus another year. And can the government increase incentives, so subsidies or whatever else, in order to get more, or perhaps place another burden on it to get less, to maximize or optimize in the models. And it's all about the central planning. So I mean, economics, what you call normal economics, is really just, it's a tool for central planners. So they're assuming that they can do it. And of course, what they have to do then is get rid of the actual agent of change, the driving force of the economy, as Mises puts it, right? Because if you have that, then that's going to screw up all your models. So you stick to the model instead, and then you sacrifice entrepreneurship. And that's sort of where they're at. So they're looking at the system as a static system, and of course the regulations are making it an ever more static system too. I mean, one way to think about it is that if the entrepreneur is causing changes and creating new value, which is what entrepreneurs really do, right? I usually put it in terms of creating our tomorrow, because that's what they're doing. Yeah. They're working today to provide us with something tomorrow that's going to change our lives. And that can't be part of a mathematical model. It's impossible. It can't be part of the statistics either, because that's from yesterday. So you can't do it. Which means that the most important variable is part of the error term in your model. Yeah. Well, if the error term is driving your model, well, that doesn't work. That's not a model. It just screws up everything, right? So instead, what they do is they just basically exclude the error term and say, well, assuming there is no such thing, then our models really apply.
Yeah, I love this mathematical way of thinking about it, the equals sign. Why would anyone trade if I'm giving you something worth 100? Why would I receive something worth 100? It doesn't make any sense. I'll give you something that I think is worth 80 and get something from you that I think is worth 120. So we've just got rid of the equals sign right there. And this noise as well is what kept the Soviet Union going, of course, because if you create a society in which the only entrepreneurs are allowed to be the central planners and the people at the central banks, then they only survive on the noise of black markets, which they don't control. So the black markets produce all the food, all the goods that people are actually trading illicitly, but the state lets them get away with it, because if they did shut that down, everyone would starve to death. So it does seem odd to me how we can have economics without an entrepreneur being in there. But that's probably enough on the book. I just want to ask you one last thing about the book. It's been very successful. It's been received very well. I love it. I think it is a great book. I mean, I'll keep reading economics in one lesson, just occasionally, just because it's such a great book. But I think I'll recommend your book as the primer to anyone who asks me. But now that you've done that, when Rothbard first met Mises said, you need to write a treatise. You know, you can't be a real economist until you've written a treatise. So Rothbard went off and came back a couple of years later with Man, Economy and State. Do you feel like writing, now that you've got this skeleton, do you feel like expanding the skeleton and writing a treatise on economics?
Well, I think writing a treatise on economics would be fantastic. I mean, I think it would be a lot of fun. The issue, though, is that I think that time is long gone. I think it was sort of gone already when Rothbard wrote his Man, Economy and State. This is something that they did back in the day. Then they wrote a treatise, and that was sort of, this is what I deliver to humankind, right? That sort of thing. Nowadays, no one really writes books at all, at least not in academia. So I think it would be a waste of time in that sense. And I'm not sure I have a whole lot to say in a treatise format either, because usually that covers the whole thing. And there's plenty that has been done already. And I don't think anybody else, especially me, I don't need to just repeat what Mises has already stated, what Rothbard has already stated, what Menger has already stated.
Yeah.
So I think it makes more sense to take a slice that is not properly developed yet and add to that. And I mean, that's what I did with my previous two books. I tried to address, well, economic growth indirectly, and why there are firms in the first one, and then the unrealized as the sort of long-term implications of regulations in the other one. I have one that is sort of under contract that is supposed to summarize what entrepreneurship is about. Mm-hmm. But I want to continue on that and work on that, because I think that Austrian economics is fantastic, and some of the things that we pride ourselves with is that we have a theory of the entrepreneur and the theory of capital. My problem with those is not that we have those theories, because that's something that separates us from everybody else, but that they're so underdeveloped. We don't really know a whole lot about either of those two things. So I've been dabbling with both a little bit, and of course they have a lot to do with each other. So writing a book on entrepreneurship, maybe a couple books on entrepreneurship and also on capital theory would be sort of the next steps book-wise. But the books are not part of the career, though. That's different.
Yeah, and then tie those two things together in a third book, which would be good.
Potentially.
So let's talk about your other books nearer the end of the program when we're wrapping up. I just wanted to move on to some other things. You mentioned stuff a few minutes ago about massive change. Now to my mind, we're at a major crossroads in history, in economics. So we've had 50 years of fiat money, and that's created, as Mises predicted it would, massive chaos around the world. We've had governments printing money to fund shutdowns of economies over the common cold, variant viruses. We've just seen massive chaos around the world. It's getting worse and worse and worse. We're on the verge, perhaps, of another banking crisis. But at the same moment, we're seeing the rise of OpenAI. We're seeing the rise of ChatGPT and GPT-4, and that's worrying a lot of wealthy, well-paid middle-class people like doctors and engineers and various others. So before, I would have had to hire a computer programmer to write me, like you or me 20 years ago, to create a website. Now I just show a picture to GPT-4 and it does all the Python code for me. So as an entrepreneur, you've tried entrepreneurship a few times, as well as lecture about entrepreneurship, which is brilliant because you've tried it and you've seen how it works. What advice, how do you see the state of the world at the moment? And what advice can you give to people about who are a bit scared at the moment about AI? What advice can you give them about being more confident about the future?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what AI can do, I don't really see AI as different than any production capital. I mean, from an economics point of view, it's really just something that can take over repetitive tasks, much like a machine can do in production. Instead of having people carrying stuff, the machine can carry it and people don't have to carry it anymore. So it replaces those sort of things. And AI really does the same. Like you said, with code, you can, if you want a certain outcome, I mean, you produce the code to get there. Well, of course, an algorithm can do that just as well, or maybe even better than a human can potentially fix problems in software code too. In actually the languages that are not always perfect, and perhaps write up things, write summaries of books and things like that. It's definitely not perfect. I mean, I had ChatGPT write a summary of my own book, and it did a nice job. It looked like a really good review, except that it added stuff that is not in the book. So it's not reliable. But I think that the way to think of this is really that, well, where is the human strength? Well, the whole economy is about creating value for others, and that's why you get value back. That's it. So what is it that you can do? Well, you can figure out how to be of value and be of service to others. And I think this sort of a lazy approach to a career where you say, oh, I want to be a professional in graphical design or whatever. And then you get a job somewhere in graphical design and you just do whatever projects are there. I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. And I tell my students this too, that what you should think about is not how to do those tasks, because tasks can always be replaced by some automation, if it's an AI or a machine or whatever. What you should figure out is how can you actually contribute value, both to the final customer and to your employer. Because if you contribute value, well, then you can first keep your job and get a job, and also you will get a raise because you are actually creating value. And value is the whole point of it. So figuring out what you can contribute, basically be an entrepreneur, whether that's not necessarily the case that you have to start a business and hire people, but be entrepreneurial. So I think in a sense, adopting the gig economy, because the gig economy is taking us in that direction. It's used in a sort of derogatory manner that, oh, the gig economy is going to exploit people. But it doesn't. It liberates you from the office, and it liberates you from 40-hour work weeks that someone else has planned for you. Yeah. And if you then think, oh, well, you don't have to use Uber or whatever, you can instead offer your services, whatever it might be, even if it's just offering tell good night stories to kids, for parents who are too busy, or help out in a home for the elderly, to just be a friendly face or whatever it might be. All those things, they can't be replaced by an AI. And whatever things that we think can be replaced by an AI is not going to happen for many years anyway. But figuring out how you can be of service to other people, because that's what the economy is about. It's not really about producing stuff. It's about being creative and producing value. Usually that is through stuff, but I don't think it will be in the future, because machines can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently trying to build a Django Python website which uses Python machine learning. And I'd love it if ChatGTP just wrote me the Django code, because Django, I think, is my 6th or 7th web environment I've learned. And Django's so nasty compared to something like React or whatever. But I'm getting very technical. There was one thing you mentioned there. You mentioned how you asked ChatGPT to summarize your book, and it came back with a slightly inaccurate précis, which you had to modify slightly. Now, some have said, Elon Musk in particular, that ChatGTP is skewed because it's got this built-in left-wing, left coast bias into it, with diversity and inclusivity and everything. And he says it's telling people lies because it's got this inbuilt left-wing political bias. And he's thinking about creating something called TruthGTP, which will just give you the unvarnished response and might give a better summary of your book. What do you think of Elon Musk's anti-AI ideas?
Well, I don't think that TruthGPT is a bad idea. I think that the problem right now is that what we call an AI is not really artificial intelligence. I mean, we even invented a new term in order to separate what we used to call AI from what is now called AI. I mean, artificial general intelligence, because this is it's basically a fancy search engine, and it uses a lot of text online to figure out what to say next. So it mimics a conversation with people. So that's why people are, wow, look at that. I'm chatting with a computer and there's no one there. Yeah, okay, fine. But it also means that it's making shit up, basically, based on what is already on there, online, and wherever they have trained this through machine learning. So yes, there's going to be a bias because there's a bias in what is posted online. So whatever they chose to train it on, there's going to be a bias, and there's probably rules involved too that sort of further pushes answers in one direction. I mean, there are certain things you can't say, and you can't get it to use slurs and whatever else, right?
Yep.
Getting this type of engine to produce true answers would be a very different thing than just letting it sift through the internet, because there's so much on the internet that is not true.
Yeah.
Right? It has to check somehow that, oh, look at this. A lot of people are claiming that the earth is flat. Okay, well, according to the algorithm, because it's 90%, then the earth has to be flat. Well, that doesn't give it any truth value. Truth is not subject to democracy, right? You can't really vote on it. So figuring out how to produce one of these chats that produces true answers is going to be super hard. And from this to actually creating sort of a sentient program, I mean, that's a whole other level of progress there. We're not even close to that. We can't even define consciousness. So how can we create it?
Yeah, I've worked a bit with NLP, the natural language processing stuff, and Beautiful Soup and these things. And a lot of what ChatGPT produces seems to me just scraped off Wikipedia pages. And then Wikipedia pages themselves often have these basement-dwelling, very left-wing editors. So a lot of Wikipedia is very left-wing. So we're getting the left-wing bias of Wikipedia being scraped into ChatGTP, and then that's got its own left-wing socialist programmer bias. So we're getting a double whammy effect there. Now, we could go into hours and hours on Popper and truth and what is the least false thing, and we probably don't want to go there. So before we wrap, let's move into the kind of wrap-up stage. So it's great. We found out a bit more about you. We found out about the how to think about the economy, which is fantastic. So what are these other books that you've written? So you said you've written a couple of other books. Can you just tell us what those are?
Yeah, the first one is called The Problem of Production. It's by far probably the most theoretical, because it's based on my dissertation, but it's really very different too. In it, I'm trying to answer the question of why are there firms? Something that economists have struggled with for over 100 years, trying to figure out why are there these hierarchical sort of units organizing production when market contracting should be more effective and more efficient. And I never figured that the answers that are provided are very good. And I wanted sort of an Austrian market process answer to it. And that's a very different one than just using a static supply and demand schedule, right? So my answer is different. It has to do with innovation and that sort of thing. The second one I mentioned already, the seen, the unseen, and the unrealized. And it really goes through, I use that in my teaching actually. It goes through and explains what regulations do by simply, in a sense, it was a first attempt at explaining the economy as a process in very simple terms, just like I did in how to think about the economy. So there's a small society that you follow with people in different trades, and they trade with each other, and then there's a little growth, and you can follow along and see what happens. And then I introduce this guy who's sort of a politician, and he introduces a regulation for a good reason, the environment or whatever. And then we can follow through the same development, but with this regulation in place, and we say, oh, wait a minute, all of these things that should have happened didn't actually happen. Instead, everything sort of stops in its tracks, and we get a few other things as outcomes instead. So the point there is to just get to the unrealized and show how really destructive regulations really are. And I think they're much more destructive than libertarians usually realize.
Yeah. Now, if we could build an AI, a TruthGPT AI, where you could model the two situations, I think that would be a nice thing. This is what the market this is what the market would do without regulation. This is what it does with regulation. If we could develop that would be a fantastic thing. And you mentioned you're writing a book on entrepreneurialism. Where can we find out about these books that you've written and that you're writing? Where's the best place to get hold of you and to get hold of the work that you've created?
Well, my website is probably the best place to go. So it's perbylund.com. It's made to be an academics website, so you can expect how boring it is. I mean, its focus is on my academic work, and that's pretty much it. But there's information on my books and my books under contract and things like that too, a little bio and things like that. Of course, I'm very active on Twitter, and my handle is also just my name.
Yeah.
So that's probably where people can get in touch with me and debate things. I try to debate as much as possible, at least with people who are not unreasonably nasty, which people tend to be on Twitter, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's a cesspit, isn't it? Twitter. I find it quite uncomfortable sometimes.
It is, and I don't know why people have this urge to just be nasty in order to be nasty, and then they do it in a condescending way too. I just don't get it. But I'm there to discuss economic literacy and economic understanding, and people tend to not have much of that, so that keeps me busy. And of course, the Mises Institute website is a place to find me as well.
Yeah, I'm going to put links to everything Per's just talked about in the show notes today. Before we go, is there any one last thing that you'd like to tell our listeners before we go?
Well, sure. Well, of course, buy the book, but
great book.
Even if you don't buy it, even if $5 is too much for a book, which I hope it's not, but you can download it for free. I mean, it's published by the Mises Institute, so it's available to download, and it's a PDF. There's an EPUB, and there's an audiobook too that you can download for free. So just go to mises.org/primer, and there it is. And it's published in several languages already, and more coming. So
and it really is a short book, by the way. I downloaded it. I downloaded the EPUB, and I thought I looked at it and I thought, oh, that was going to take 5 or 6 hours, and I think I read it in about 2.5 hours. So it's nice and short, but it does have everything in it, but it's not just a complete bare bones. It's actually got a little bit of flesh on the bones as well. Okay, so Per, I've prepared this. Are you ready? What is it again? Tack for den Tid und auch Gott Nacht. Did that work?
Thank you. Yeah, same to you. Absolutely.
I think what I just tried to say there was thank you for your time today and good night. So good night, Per.
Good night. Good talking to you.